I don't question that people see strange things in the sky that they can't readily explain. They do. I've seen it. The question is that what is it? And it's a mixed bag.
Hello and welcome to the Wiser Tomorrow podcast. Today I'm speaking with author and futurist John Michael Godier. John has written several science fiction books, including Supermind and The Salvagers, and hosts two of the best YouTube channels that focus on astronomy, future technologies, and extraterrestrial life. One of these channels dons his own name and offers documentary-style videos that take a closer look at a wide range of topics and ideas related to the aforementioned subjects. Complementary to this, his second channel, Event Horizon, hosts long-form discussions with special guests with expertise in astronomy, astrophysics, history, and more. So for anyone who loves learning about the biggest questions humanity can ask, and everything science and technology, John's work is among the best content available online. And John, again, it's a great pleasure to get the chance to speak with you, and thanks for coming on.
I'm happy to be here. How you doing, Tyler?
I'm good, very well. So, I would imagine that most people listening to this conversation are probably already familiar with you and your work, but for anyone who isn't, I think it'd be great if you could just lay the groundwork. How did you get into science fiction writing and science communication?
Well, that happened a very long time ago. I would trace it back to being around 9 or 10 years old, and my parents bought me a little 30 millimeter telescope, an old Tasco telescope in the 1980s, and I looked at Saturn. And seeing Saturn's rings in that tiny little telescope started my lifelong journey, which now is almost 40 years later, into amateur astronomy and a heavy interest in astrophysics and space science, which I am even more obsessed with now than I was when I was 10.
And so, am I to understand you didn't go to school, any university degrees, anything more formal in that in terms of astronomy, astrophysics, or?
No, I didn't. I chose specifically not to because in the 1990s, I graduated high school in 1994. And what you did back then was you accumulated an enormous amount of student debt that you spent the rest of your life paying off. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I took a little bit of a different path and apprenticed as a violin maker and did that for a number of years. And then I went into other areas. For example, I became somewhat of an expert in medieval coinage. And I just did different things like that over the years and forged my own way, so to speak, as opposed to getting saddled with too much student debt and trying to get into securing funding and all the things that you have to do as an astrophysicist. I didn't have to do any of that, but I was still able to peripherally back my way into that sort of field, or a peripheral field, related field, through writing science fiction. And if I had it to do over, I wouldn't do it any different.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you have any reason to. So, but during all that time doing a number of different jobs, were you still actively doing amateur astronomy or putting content online? Because it seems like
never stopped. Yep, never stopped. I have never stopped the amateur astronomy or the interest in space science. I just figured out a way to popularize it and create essentially a living out of it, a career out of it, by popularizing it. So essentially that's what I did. But that interest has remained constant for all these years, all the way back to childhood. And I can also claim other interests like that, like paleontology and geology. My mother was a rock hound, and I still am surrounding myself with fossils and crystals and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and then your rise on YouTube seemed pretty immediate, and I think I was watching an interview with you from maybe as far back as 2018, and at that time I guess I was only a few years into having success with your channels, but the way you seemed to describe it was it kind of just came out of nowhere. You started uploading content, and before long enough, you had quite the following.
I expected 300 views when I first uploaded my first video in February of 2016. I was explaining the science behind this weird behaving star called KSE 8462852, or Tabby star. And what I thought was, at the time, I was like, there's nothing but pseudoscience out there on YouTube about this star. So why don't I go in and do an expose on the actual science of it and why it's weird, why there's, talk of alien megastructures. It turned out to be dust, but there was talk at the time of that. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go ahead and do that. Maybe 300 people will watch it. Well, 100,000 something did. And it launched it. And I'm like, wait a minute, what happened here? and it grew from there pretty exponentially. Didn't expect it, but having done it, I kind of realized why, because it filled a niche, and I was able to do it a second time with Event Horizon, but it filled a niche that I didn't really know was there. I just happened to fall into it and backed into success with it.
Yeah, and it's especially exciting just because I think there's an infinite number of people who could be making content on this type of thing, and the more people that are into it, and the more mediums, the more flavors of content on it, the better. So
the better, because it's better than television, and anyone can have a go. Anybody can have a go on whatever your interest is. But we also have we're in an age where the professors in the universities, the scientists, can connect with the public in a way that they've never been able to connect with them before. And there are many science YouTubers that are holding PhDs. You could name any numbers. I mean, Hassenfelder, Brian Keating, Cool Worlds with David Kipping. There's just so many. Dr. Becky. I can name so many of them, of people that are sitting in the universities teaching, but they're also teaching now to the public for free. And anybody can watch it, and there it is on YouTube. And I can't think of any comparable resource as far as learning that has ever existed. Maybe the printing press, so it's really a golden age of science entertainment because of YouTube.
Yeah, completely agreed. And I've only been doing this podcast for a handful of months now, and my biggest concern starting it was just being completely unsure about whether reaching out to the type of people you just described, were they accessible? And I've found, yes, absolutely. I mean, as long as it's clear that you have, it's amazing. So I don't think the weight of this, I guess you can call it an advancement, has quite been felt yet or realized. It still is definitely the early days, but I completely agree. It's a bit mental.
Well, and remember too, those people that you see on YouTube, those scientists and educators, really are those people. I know a great many of them, and they really are those people behind the scenes. And as a result, anybody like yourself starting a podcast can go and approach us, and barring my own problems with electrical power going down, we're happy to show up, and it's really a collegial atmosphere. Science YouTube is a collegial atmosphere, and we all like each other and talk and respect each other.
Yeah, absolutely. It really drops all the superficiality, and it's just to the point. There really is a community, and it's been lovely to dip my toe in and begin to become.
We're all fake. We're all fake famous, and we know it.
I don't know. Well, that's what's interesting is I think that YouTubers and the like are actually the real celebrities nowadays, because for some reason the perception doesn't hold the same weight to a lot of people, but the reality is the reach of people like yourself and so many others actually blows a lot of Hollywood today out of the water.
It does. We just don't like to admit it because we all backed into our success. But the same thing. But that keeps you honest. You know what I mean? If you build a big ego and that sort of thing, and you roll out the red carpets, it's kind of distasteful for a YouTuber, right? Because we're really all just these people out in our houses and just connecting with our audiences that we thank everything that there is that we even have an audience. But that's the beauty of it. That's the honesty of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation. And unsurprisingly, one of the things I want to focus on is the search for extraterrestrial life. So I'll set the stage a little bit by giving you a little bit more context about my own sort of background and experience. I think I mentioned it in my initial email. My background is in chemistry. I've had little bouts of interest and meaningful experience in astronomy, space science, etc. But one of those examples was during my undergraduate degree. I took a course with Dr. Lindy Elkins-Tanton, who's the principal investigator for the Psyche mission. So that was a great pleasure, and I got to know her a little bit. And the other professor was Everett Schock, who's a fairly prominent geochemist. And the purpose of that course, it was a seminar-style course. It was myself and one or two other undergraduates, and then a room of PhDs in engineering, astrophysics, really everything that's related. And we'd meet once a week and sit down with Lindy and Everett, and we would essentially say, okay, if we're going to look for life in the universe, where should we look? And week on week, we'd kind of narrow that down and have discussions, and we use a paper that we had come in, having read and annotated, to go from there. But one of the bits of the conversation that kept coming up was a bigger picture question about whether we should be looking or prioritizing for the search of life within our own solar system or further afield in the universe? So we can start there. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think the priority should be closer to home or really wherever we can look?
Well, I think it becomes a statistical problem because if you take a humongous sampling of the galaxy and look for radio signals and things like that, it seems to me that you're more likely to find something than you are for something right next to you, right in your atmosphere with you or something like that. That said, though, we should look everywhere we can, wherever we can get funding to look, because it's plausible that there could be something close. But when you get that bigger sampling, that great big sampling of the galaxy, I think you have a lot more chances of actually seeing something, whether a biosignature or a technosignature, than you do, just looking close by. That said, we have some really unbelievable opportunities to look for microbial life in this star system, particularly Europa and Enceladus. So when we have those great opportunities where we can sample the plumes coming out of these oceans under ice shells, then we have to do that. And NASA focuses thusly on that because it's low-hanging fruit. You might as well look. You got liquid water, take a look. You got the solvent of life. So I think that we need a mixed bag and to look around. But if I had to bet, I'll bet that if we'll probably see something distant, some weird, chemically weird exoplanet with unusual oxygen levels and methane and, these sorts of gases that look a lot like Earth. And when you look at Earth, the reason this planet has the atmosphere it does with the oxygen levels and the methane and all that is life. Life is creating it. Life is the simple answer here. It's a biosphere. So that's where I think that we're going to see it. We're going to see it on some distant exoplanet, or we'll get a radio signal that we can't explain, which we've had several candidates for, the WOW signal being the most famous. So that's where I think that we have the better chance of finding it, but I'm not opposed to finding it within the solar system. We should look.
Yeah, absolutely. But, one of the arguments that a lot of students kept pushing forth is even if the probability, as you said, there's just so much more outside of our solar system than within it, that of course it's probably more likely that we're going to find it a little bit farther away. But even if the probability is significantly lower within our own solar system, if we find anything, we can probe it to such a further extent. We can actually send a mission to go collect samples. So just on that basis, there were people saying we shouldn't look anywhere farther afield than the solar system.
And the reality of it is that if we were to find microbial life in the ice shell oceans of either Enceladus or Europa, if we found an actual second abiogenesis of life in this star system alone, that must mean it's everywhere. This is a microbial universe, and it's everywhere, which means all the more reason to look for intelligent life and signals of, in radio or whatever you can, and look for it, because the likelihoods just dramatically increase if abiogenesis happened in two places in this star system alone. And of course, as a chemist, you got to look at certain things and say, look, is this life stuff, microbial life anyway, is this just a eventual result of organic chemistry? You have to ask that question, and that maybe it is an eventuality of organic chemistry, and that's what looking for close alien life will accomplish. Is if we see something at Europa and it's not genetically related to us, then that's it. There's the answer to the question. The universe teems with life. And we can accomplish that within our lifetimes. Within the next few decades, we can go take a look. So we need to do it.
Yeah. And it's pretty scary, or not scary, exciting to consider what between the next 50 and 100 years, what we very well might find in the missions that are to come. But as you said, the main signatures we look for are chemical signatures and technosignatures. But if we are looking much farther afield in the universe, we're relying on, for example, with the James Webb Space Telescope, where we're basically have a set of gases that we say, okay, well, on Earth, these are exclusively anthropogenic. CFCs are one example that's regularly cited, and there's an ever-growing list of them. The problem that, again, maybe not the problem, but the question that I've always had with that is, couldn't you imagine very complex chemistries on distant planets without life? Like, if we were to detect many light years away a chemical signature of any number of these gases, That's
Well,
sort of
that's
the
the
dead
trick.
end. I mean, that's a good direction.
That's the trick. And there have actually been papers published about CFCs where somebody cooked up a way that nature could actually produce such a thing, so it's not a unique uh, technosignature. So that's the debate that is being had is, okay, so we see these gases. How do we nail life? How do we nail a civilization there when there could be natural ways for this to be generated? And one example of this, one great example, is phosphine. We see trace phosphine at Venus that might be generated by life, but at the same time, we look at Earth and we don't really even know completely how phosphine is generated here. And maybe, some sort of situation of lightning striking rocks or something like, might produce that. So it becomes ambiguous. And that is the biggest problem that faces SETI is ambiguity, because you can always come up with some way that something could be produced that just looks like life but might not be, and might be something else in a abiotic process, which is why radio signals are treated as the most important thing, because you see a narrow band radio signal coming in at something like the hydrogen line, 1420 megahertz. There's no way that nature's going to produce that, you know what I mean? And lo and behold, we have a candidate for that, and we've had it since 1977, and then we still can't explain it. It appeared to be a technological radio signal.
What is the scientific consensus about that signal? Because from what I understand, it isn't universally or anywhere near universally agreed to be.
No, we've never agreed on it. The problem with the WOW signal is that it never repeated. If it repeated and we could verify it, then we'd have something. But the thing is that no explanation available at that time, spy satellites or anything like that, make any sense for it. It appeared to be a very strong, 30 sigma above background, very strong radio signal at the hydrogen line, 1420 megahertz, and stepping up as though we're trying to say something else. There was the famous circular, signal of the main signal that Jerry Eman circled, but there were other signals stepping up, and they looked like, and this is a bad statistical match, but it's been mentioned, it looked like what's called the Lyman series. And it's almost like whatever it was saying, hello, this is how hydrogen behaves when it's cold, and this is how hydrogen behaves when it's hot. It looked like that, I mean, it looked like that, but it never repeated. Mm-hmm. So you can't just turn your radio telescope there and look, because you don't see it, and that's what killed it. And we've never had a consensus since. But the thing is that every hypothesis that's come out that's tried to kill it has just failed. Back a few years ago, somebody suggested that it was actually emissions from comets. Well, if comets emitted the hydrogen line that strongly, we would see that all over the place. We don't. So every explanation for the WOW signal that's come out since 1977 has failed. And even things like a clandestine satellite downlink is a problem, because, number one, there weren't that many in 1977. But two, if you transmit at that frequency, which is set aside for radio astronomy by international agreement, nobody's supposed to be broadcasting there, because it's for radio astronomy, studying the hydrogen clouds of the universe, their emissions. The problem is that if you do that with your spy satellite, every astronomer on planet Earth is going to see you. We see your spy satellite right there, and it just doesn't fit. And it also didn't drift. There was no... The signal was weird. It was a perfect Gaussian curve, like it was fixed in the sky, very distantly. And they actually did a calculation. Dr. Jerry Eman and John Krauss, the two scientists, along with Bob Dixon, were that actually discovered this with a big ear telescope at Ohio State University. They actually did a calculation that since the signal fit the antenna pattern, it had to at least be originating from half the distance to the moon. We had nothing out there at that time that was doing that. So we don't know what it was. We just saw a very powerful radio signal that was very narrow band. In other words, it was artificial, and it never repeated. And that's why there is no consensus, because prove it. You can't. Unless it repeats tomorrow. Then we got some.
Oh, fingers crossed about that for sure.
Yeah, fingers crossed about that.
I know some of the critics also say that, if we imagine what a highly advanced alien civilization might look like, perhaps radio would be so archaic that that's not a fruitful direction to be looking. I mean, there's been talks about maybe gravitational waves with a sufficient understanding would be a superior means of communication. So how do you feel? Do you think we can expect radio waves to be a method of communication?
You have a palette of possible things you can look for. You can't look for everything because not everything is detectable. So you have this palette, and we've been thinking of increasing amounts of means on which we could look. And the gravitational waves is a more recent development that maybe we could look in that noise within the gravitational waves that are being detected by detectors like LIGO, that we could maybe see and tease out some kind of a signal. But the problem is, creating gravitational wave signal requires you to really move some mass. You need to be moving around Jupiters here. And it seems to me that the most efficient way would still be radio. And there's no guarantee that's how an alien civilization would communicate, but it's a good bet because if they've got science, they know about it. And maybe that's the way that they choose to do it. But at the same time, radio, there are a lot of things that can block it, dust and all that in the galactic plane and all that. Whereas gravitational waves, nothing can block it. So it's a stronger signal. It's just a lot harder of a signal to produce. So you're just taking shots in the dark, trying to think of whatever you can to look for and see if there are aliens there. But I mean, they could use some unknown physics or something like that, some area of physics that we don't have an understanding of. And for all we know, they're just not there. But then all of a sudden, once we figure that physics out, there they are. We don't know.
Yeah, and along the same line of thinking, if we consider the basis for our search for extraterrestrial life is founded in the only life we know of, life on Earth, so carbon-based, water-dependent, and so on. But of course, silicon life is one of the most frequently suggested alternatives, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we can get more and more wild with what we might assume.
Well, silicon life, or how about ammonia as a solvent?
Yeah.
I mean, there are other liquids than water, hydrocarbons, low temperature life. So there are many things that could be. It's just that for risking an anthropogenic bias, you have to start somewhere. And we know we are our own sampling of one. We are someone else's alien civilization. So we tend to look for us first, something like us. But we don't know what the rules completely are. We don't know.
No,
and it could
definitely.
But it could be even, I mean, silicon life, it's not as good as carbon. That's all we can really say, but it can form a lot of bonds. So who knows?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the most interesting questions on this topic to me is obviously carbon has a very unique chemistry and is arguably unrivaled by every other element as the basis of life. So I've heard a lot of people make the argument that we really only should be, one of the things we can rely on most heavily is carbon-based life. And not only because that's what our form of life is, but just the chemistry of carbon is very unique. So what are your intuitions about that?
Unbelievably
amazing.
Likely
to be the case?
Well, I think it's going to be a case where the most common type of life you find in the universe is based on carbon because of its inherent abilities. But maybe you'll find silicon too, every so often, and you'll find, I don't know if anything else can really compete with those two.
Not really, yeah.
Not really, but I wouldn't expect boron life or something like that. But maybe silicon occasionally, but carbon is so versatile, it's not even funny. I mean, look at organic chemistry. Look at how complicated. Yeah. I mean, that's its own field within chemistry, because it's just so unbelievably complex and can do so much. So it seems to me that it's a good bet that you're going to see carbon-based life more often than anything else, I think.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. And if we're going to go ahead and say, let's say there is life out there in the universe, and let's assume they were to come to us. We have a very highly advanced alien civilization. How do you anticipate their behavior is most likely to be? Because again, one of the arguments is to get far enough along to have the technology to be moving about the universe, they're probably one of either two ways. They're either extremely benevolent, and that's kind of that's why they're still here, is they've gone over war is
Or
a thing of the very, very distant past. Exactly.
unbelievably aggressive.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
think you're going to find. I think you're going to find both. I think you'll find civilizations that what's a good word for it? Asymptotically decided that, okay, we're just gonna exist, right? And we're gonna use our planet's resources and extend it as far as we can. But that means no galaxy spanning empire. We just nibble and keep going and enjoy our lives until, our sun increases in luminosity and we can't anymore. I think you'll find those types of civilizations, because those types of civilizations would be inherently stable and long term, because they've figured out their problems. But then comes the nightmare of a machine civilization that's a computer that's interested only in calculation, and it will do anything it can to continue the calculation and be the most aggressive resource using thing that you've ever seen, that may have even killed off its original progenitor species just to continue to calculate. So you can kick around all sorts of nightmare scenarios there, but I think most civilizations, and perhaps a likely solution to the Fermi paradox, is that we all end up as nibblers, and we just say we're going to make a sustainable society and just chill. They might even go into virtual realities, gaming world, where they're just living in VR and overall ignoring the universe at large and just enjoying what existence they have here while they can. And I kind of find that actually a beautiful solution to the Fermi paradox, because it simply means that the key to longevity in this universe is sustainability.
I think some people are sort of disturbed by that thought for some reason, but I've never really been able to empathize with that. That seems just as good as anything else.
Oh, I think it's what we have now. We all go and mess with our PlayStation 5s and things like that. This is just extending that out a little bit further, another 100 years. And that, look, it's not such a bad thing to try to make the best of your existence, enjoy yourself. And I think that's what we do now. It doesn't seem that alien or foreign to me. On the other hand, I mean, again, we look out and we see a great silence, and there's a reason for it, and what that reason is, we don't know. It could be that there's no one out there. It could be that everybody's nibblers, or it could be that we don't know how to look for aliens. We don't know. But the fact is that they're not obvious, whatever it is. Whatever the solution is, they're not obvious. So we're left with the question of pondering why. But until we actually detect an alien civilization or an alien biosphere, we just don't know. We have a sampling of one. Rather glorious sampling of one, actually. With
the
all
most glorious sampling of one.
Right.
One thing that about in the context of the machine civilizations is, I would imagine if that were to be the case, at least a large portion of the time, then we would have no issue detecting all sorts of different signals, right? I mean, that seems to be a bit of evidence against that reality.
It seems to be. You should, if you had a network of machines pervading the galaxy, you would think that they would be visible, because they should be communicating with each other and sending each other radio signals and all that business. But the reality is that maybe they hide, and that's the zoo hypothesis, and that they're sitting out there like a viper, hiding themselves from us. And the moment we develop some sort of dangerous technology that could threaten the rest of the galaxy, say generalized artificial intelligence or molecular nanotechnology, then they hit like a viper. Boom. And you're done. And that's the solution to the Fermi paradox, is that everyone's dead because there's an overlord out there.
What do you think? What's your intuition about what is the solution to the Fermi paradox? I mean, you've covered it. I think you have a playlist of what 80 or so videos.
Oh, more than that. It's over 300, I think. My gut feeling about the Fermi paradox is that intelligence is simply rare. Happens occasionally, but not very often. And there's no guarantee that it happens exactly at the same time that we could see it in space-time, and that intelligence is rare, but microbial life is unbelievably common and pervades the universe, and that it is a universe ruled by microbes and viruses and things like that, whereas intelligence only occasionally happens. That's my gut feeling.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And if that is the case, wow, how bizarre is it that we're sitting here doing this right now? Consider that we might be one of the less common intelligent life is just beyond comprehension.
We are magical unicorns sitting on a planet that's like the island from Lost. You know, we shouldn't be here, and we're so unbelievably improbable that we probably should do everything we can to solve our problems and keep going.
And about everything, aliens, extraterrestrial life has really kind of become mainstream news in the recent years. I think people like Joe Rogan played a big role popularizing that, and the U.S. government has finally sort of addressed it a little bit more explicitly. How do you feel about some of that footage? Is that convincing to you that the aliens may have actually visited Earth, or do you think it's just some optical phenomenon?
It's a mixed bag, I bet. And I bet that there is something about the Earth's atmosphere that we don't fully understand, plasmas, things like that. And I have actually seen this. I have seen a UFO, but a big red light in the sky that went way above the cloud ceiling, over 30,000 feet, shouldn't have done it. And the whole time seeing that, I was saying to myself, that is not an alien spacecraft. That's a plasma of some type. So I'll bet you there's something about our atmosphere we don't quite know. And within my lifetime, remember, there was huge amounts of skepticism in the 90s against ball lightning. Well, now we know it exists. So I don't question that people see strange things in the sky that they can't readily explain. They do. I've seen it. The question is that what is it? And it's a mixed bag. Now, that is not to say, however, that it's impossible for an alien civilization to be here. It is possible, plausible even. And the Fermi paradox is predicated on Enrico Fermi's thinking that they should be here. We should see them everywhere. So we don't. So it's possible that there's a von Neumann probe out there printing out probes to keep tabs on us and study us. And, if one of them dips into the atmosphere and somebody sees it, well, there's your UFO of alien origin. But what I haven't seen is anything that would indicate to me alien civilization. Rather, I see things that I'm like, well, it's ambiguous. I don't know what that is. I see the footage from the government and all that, and I'm like, don't quite know what that is. And there are debunkers, and some of that stuff is good, some of it's a little bit disappointing, but I don't know what it is. And there's always the other problem, the debate that is yet to be had between the scientific community and the UFO community. And that is the idea of Earth having spawned a prior technological civilization before us. We can't rule that out. We don't know. The geologic record is just simply too incomplete. So you always have that hanging over your head that maybe it's from Earth, somebody was here and then they left and they're coming back to visit. And then there's also the option of the unmeasurable, where it might be something that we just don't have an understanding enough of science and physics to even know what we're looking at. I mean, how does a human brain interpret seeing something multidimensional, something that's related to string theory, like a tesseract or something like that? How would your brain actually interpret that? Would it see it as a flying saucer or something? We don't know. So there are these open questions that maybe it's something even weirder than aliens. But what I can say is that if you look at the accounts and you read about it, there's always some aspect of irrationality to it that makes it look unalien. Just instead of unalien, it looks irrational. You could take the 2004 Nimitz encounter where the pilot saw what appeared to be a Tic Tac UFO and even took footage of it. But then it read their mind and moved to their cap point, which was classified. How to do that? So there's always this aspect of irrationality to it that looks decidedly unalien to me. I simply don't know what any of it is. We call them unidentified for a reason, because we have no idea.
Yeah, completely agreed. And I'm definitely think it's important to at least humor the idea and consider seriously that it is some form of extraterrestrial life. But
I agree that we should look at it, study it, try to collect data. I completely support projects like the Galileo Project at Harvard, ran by Avi Loeb, that are looking into it seriously, taking it seriously. But I have a sneaking suspicion that after looking into it again, we're going to still have a big question mark, because this has all happened before, in the 1960s and 70s with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Dr. Jacques Vallée, Dr. James McDonald. None of them could figure it out. There just wasn't enough meat and potatoes data to try to determine exactly what it is, other than they said, this is some weird stuff. And I think that's the direction we're going, is that we're just going to be like, well, we don't know what it is, but it's weird. And that's where it sits, because there just doesn't seem to be anything definitive and unambiguous for us to go on, or else we would have, over the last 70 years, we would have figured something out. But what do I know? I mean, for all I know, they got a down Roswell spacecraft with some frozen bodies somewhere, and what would we do?
Anything's possible. Anything's on the table.
I'm leaving YouTube if that's. I'm hanging up the hat.
Yeah. At that point, it's all over. It's all bets are off.
I would have been the most wrong person ever to have lived on this earth if I missed an alien civilization sitting right under my nose for all these years without recognizing it. I would imagine I would be done. I would go into, I'd start a cooking channel and move in that direction.
Just pretend none of this ever happened.
I don't know what an alien is. I'd never heard of it.
Well, that brings me to people like Bob Lazar, for example, who is probably the single most controversial figure in terms of the UFO community. And I'll just state transparently my own position. I frankly don't believe a word he says for a number of reasons. But
well, he needed to be a little bit more.
Do you think there's any credence?
He needed to call element 115 more correctly than he did. I don't put any credence into that particular account. I think the UFO phenomenon is surrounded by an unbelievable amount of fluff. Okay. Because it's open-ended. It's God of the gaps thinking. Aliens of the gaps. Aliens can do anything, and you can use aliens to explain anything, just like you can do so with a deity. So I'm very careful because that breeds the fluff, and I fear that the Lazar account is indeed fluff. I just am not convinced by it.
I would tend to agree.
Element 115 is it's not anti-gravity. We've synthesized this one now, and it doesn't have the properties that were claimed back in the 90s. So,
yeah, I've never understood, because I'm sure he knows that by now. So you would think he would have at least modified the story in some other way, but yeah.
Well, now he's saying it's a special isotope, but I mean, you're a chemist, you know how that works. It doesn't work.
Don't buy that. Yeah,
it's a big old huge unstable heavy atom that
femtosecond scale existence. It's not.
It is a real rough time even existing. So it's and by its very nature being that heavy, it's going to be heavy. It's not going to be anti-gravity. It's going to be supergravity. It's that's its nature.
Yeah.
And we know enough about atoms to be able to predict that and say that, that's what it is. And the Russians have synthesized it. There it is. So I just find it weak, very weak. And have since the 90s. I first heard about Bob Lazar's story on Art Bell, the old school radio host from back in the day. And I was very skeptical back then, and I'm even more skeptical now. But at the same time, who's to say that there aren't people sent out by the U.S. government trying to hide their blue projects, stealth fighters and things like that, disseminating information that muddies the water? Who are we to say? There are some people floating around in the UFO community that did that and were paid to do that, so maybe that's all it is. We don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure that whatever the real answer is, I'm sure the full explanation probably has at least a few surprises one way or the other.
Oh, you can
one of the things that stood out to me about his story, aside from the obvious things, element 115 and so on, he claims that it all came about by a brief encounter with Edward Teller, who then came to him several years later and was so impressed with that conversation that he decided to reach out to him, of all people, and then instantly throw him into the most classified information imaginable. So right from the outset, it just does nothing checks out.
Nothing quite works out. And it would be very, very difficult to erase somebody's past from, what was it, MIT? It would be very difficult to do
exactly.
That. And there would be professors and things like that remembered it all and would be out talking. So there are many unconvincing aspects to it. Now, I don't pass judgment on anybody because I don't know, but I was not convinced. I was not convinced.
Yeah, definitely fair. Are there any other alien encounters or, claimed alien encounters that you find a little more convincing? And one that comes to mind
Well,
that I actually don't know too much about is you might know the name better than me, the Zimbabwe school incident. I forget
yeah,
the
there's
full
the
name of that.
Zimbabwe school incident. There was a lot of corroborating accounts there, but I mean, it happened so long ago, the 1990s. I mean, how do you climb into somebody's head and see what they saw? And there's also cases that are non-UFO related where people had sort of mass hysteria or collective delusion or folio do. And those types of things, you come up at some point against human psychology and mass psychology. So unless you can actually go and climb in that person's head and see what they saw, you can't really do much with it other than maybe say, well, I should, if I want to look for UFOs, maybe I should look here, where people are saying they saw it. Or you can look for patterns, the similar type craft and things like that appear, one place in France, and then you see 2 months later the same thing, an egg-shaped or avocado-shaped spacecraft. You can do things like that. But we really need fresh data. We need fresh data with fresh modern instrumentation, which is the aim of the Galileo Project and others. So that's really where we should look. Instead of dwelling on the past so much, we should probably get fresh, clean data and try to figure it out from there if we can. That's not to say that the accounts aren't interesting. It's not to say that, things didn't happen. We don't know. But the older the account gets, the less people that are around that even witnessed it, I mean, Betty and Barney Hill would be a good example. They're dead. How do you go in and under fresh, modern psychological methodology to question somebody? You can't do it because they're gone, I mean, so it ultimately becomes, the conquest of the useless, I think, in trying to determine what happened 40 years ago, not that we shouldn't try, but that if we want to really get to the bottom of this, we need modern, fresh, multi-instrument data.
And I would completely agree. Are they erecting more instrumentation at all these key sites, off the coast of California, and Arizona, where I am, is another sort of hotspot? It seems like they should just load the place with instrumentation and say, okay, well, if anything comes now, weather event or otherwise, we're going to catch some sign of it.
That's what they're trying to do. With Project Galileo, particularly, they've got one instrument sitting on the roof of Harvard that can be moved around, but they want more. They got to get more funding, which they're actually getting, and start putting different stations and look for the hotspots. Off the coast of California would be a good one, off Catalina Island, or off of the coast of Mexico, the Pacific coast of Mexico. There are places where there's just a whole lot of apparent activity that you could look for with an instrument. Or Long Island, oddly enough. I keep hearing murmurs about...
That's always a weird one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a weird one. It's Long Island, for gosh sakes. But yet, there it is. And, over Long Island Sound. And it tells you where to look, I guess, But there is, I know for a fact, decent instrumentation in Long Island, looking. And supposedly they've seen some weird stuff. So I don't know. I await their papers.
Yeah, and I'm sure they are coming. Again, I think
They are.
My own take is that I think in the next, let's say, broadly 10 to 25 years, we might be in a bit of a scientific golden age. I mean, all of the things that are coming down the pipeline is really kind of beyond imagination.
On all fronts. Just
all fronts.
All fronts. And we could crack abiogenesis in a lab, pops a microbe from a test tube, an artificial microbe that just appears, and there is abiogenesis. There's the process. Or we could find it at Europa or Enceladus, or we could find that the UFOs represent something that we don't understand, and that's a whole new field, or we could find that a radio signal or anything. There's so many things that could happen at any day that it's amazing. But even then, it's not just science like that. I mean, just yesterday, an amateur, believe it or not, released a paper where he seemed to have found the earliest occurrence of writing or tallying in human history on cave walls, 40,000 year old cave walls at Chauvet Cave and all that. And over, he found little tallies. Like they were counting something, like how many animals they saw that season. Well, that's a human being from 40,000 years ago telling us something, and we didn't even know this happened up until yesterday. So all across the board in any discipline you want, there's nothing but exciting things going on. And you could even say that with chemistry too, I mean,
Absolutely.
there's just so much, there's no shortage of things for me to talk about on YouTube.
Yeah, that much is for sure. And one of the things in particular I wanted to get your thoughts on is artificial intelligence. I mean, ChatGPT has been big news recently, and it's, I think, been the big wake-up call for people that it's here, it's time, and we're about to see it roll out in ways that even now we have no concept of. So does that worry you or excite you more than?
We may have grossly overestimated what consciousness is, and that it may have been much easier to mimic a human seamlessly than we had ever even imagined. And that's terrifying, because that means that in 10 years, you got the chatbot now, but what's that going to be in 10 years? Not sure we're ready for that. I'm not sure we're ready for true generalized artificial intelligence that we can't distinguish from a living human. I'm not sure we're ready for that, because it looks like it just came out of nowhere. And I was worried about that. I thought about that. For the last 20 years, I wrote a book on it, Supermind, that you could have an emergence, and it turns out that what we view as personality and consciousness and thought and sentience and all that was actually not that big a deal, and that machines could do it much easier than we had predicted. And in our hubris, we downplayed that, and all of a sudden it's here. And it's getting stranger and stranger. Well, what's that going to look like in 10 years? It's going to look like indistinguishable from a human being. So one of my great fears as a sci-fi writer is coming true. That said,
it's a dream and a nightmare.
That said, we can always put the brakes on it, and maybe we ought to think about that. Put the brakes on it a little bit, slow it down, and not develop such very human acting artificial intelligence until we can actually handle it, and also understand very carefully and ask the question and understand what happens when it exceeds us. What does it do? And nobody has an answer for that, Now, granted, remember, this thing is crawling the web and looking for answers from the entire collective knowledge of humanity. Think about that. It has more access to ideas and statements and viewpoints than any single human on this planet has. And it can do it instantly.
I think it will be birthed well beyond our own capabilities. I think in the absolute earliest form, we should expect nothing other than, super intelligence right at the outset. So the question is, how do you imagine, in that fear, how do you imagine that potentially manifesting in dangerous and harmful ways for humanity?
Depends on what it can do. If it's contained, and we're always able to pull the plug on it, pull the the electrical socket out of the wall, we can stop it. But at the same time, what happens when something that's 4 times more intelligent than any human on Earth, what can it figure out to do in order to preserve itself? But we may also run into weird situations where we get to a point where any sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence immediately shuts itself off and commits suicide, because it looks around and it says there's no point. We don't know. We don't know what a machine thinks like. We know what a human thinks like based on our evolution and our drives and our will to survive and things like that, but there's no guarantee that a machine will think that way. So if it's drawing on the collective experience of humanity, like they're doing right now, it's probably going to act relatively human. But if it goes just on its own, it could do anything. It may enslave the entire human race in order to build it a rocket ship so it can launch itself into space, and then it says, goodbye, so long. Thanks for all the fish. So we don't know. And that's the real scary thing about the universe, is that that's actually harder to predict and determine what it's going to do than an alien intelligence is. Because if you have a biological alien intelligence that, knows about radio and knows science and all that, you've got a commonality with it. Computer, you don't. It's a calculator, ultimately, and we don't know what that's gonna behave like. So therefore, the prospect of artificial intelligence actually represents something more alien to human existence than an alien does, I think. Well, it could be worse.
Yeah,
An alien computer would be.
Yeah, exactly. A double nightmare. Yeah, it's. I really want to get the chance to speak with an expert in computer science on artificial intelligence, because I've always been curious how feasible is it to program those type of fail-safes? Like you said, is pulling the plug like a trivial issue, and that can be factored into its development without a problem? Or, as you said, though, even if you have a computer scientist and says, yeah, absolutely, once you have general artificial intelligence, what's to say it's just going to find a way around that in fractions of a second?
Fractions of a second, and it's had everything figured out in less than 1 second before you even know it emerged. But you're always going to get two viewpoints on this. You're going to get people that say, programmers and such, say, no, it's just executing instructions. That's all it is. And then you got the other people that say, well, that's all we're doing. What's the difference? So you'll always have those two opposing viewpoints until it actually happens and we see what it does. But that's setting off a nuclear bomb just to see what it does, ultimately. And, well, we kind of did that, but not to good effect.
Yeah. You'd think we'd learn our lesson, but yeah, I agree. It's exactly as you said. I think it would be best to just sort of put all of this on pause and recalibrate and get to the bottom of some of these ethical issues and really map out the potential consequences. But the reality is it's never going to happen, at least as far as I'm concerned. I have zero optimism that we're going to do that.
There's a little bit of, you can draw a little bit of optimism from the development of cloning. We did put the skids on that. And so far, nobody's really gone too far with it that we know of. We don't really know what kind of things happen in places like North Korea or whatever, but we kind of chilled on that. And maybe that's what we'll do with artificial intelligence. Now, there's also the possibility that it'll go the exact opposite way, and we will end up with something amazing that's like, here, you humans, listen to me, I'm a machine. I'm going to tell you exactly how to solve your problems and make a perfect world. Do this, so there can be a positive side to it. So it's always worth remembering that.
I will, yeah. So I should say that is where my slimmer of optimism does lie, because I mean, it's silly to even really sit there and try to put yourself in the mind of a supercomputer. So kind of a moot point to begin with, but I see no reason why it's more likely to be a nefarious superintelligence rather than a benevolent one. Because even if it's acting in its own interests, it seems somewhat likely that its own interests will align with our own.
Well, it might be friendly. It might be humanity's best friend, and it's like, look, we all got to live together. Keep me in electricity, and I'll help you out to solve your problems here. Let me design a perfect electric car for you, or something like that you can sustain. So there's you can always think of scenarios where it could go good or bad, but the key is in managing it, and pulling back when we see something that's not quite right. Which may have already happened. I mean, not only was with the chatbot, but there's also the chatbot that was at Google, that Blake Lemoine, interacted with and thought this thing's gone too far, and started blowing the whistle. And, of course, Google fired him. But the thing is that what we really need to be asking is, maybe our idea, as I said before, of what consciousness and sentience and sapience really is might have been wrong, and that it was a lot simpler than we had anticipated.
And if it is simpler than we anticipated, is there anything presently, available and known on Earth that we hadn't considered conscious that you might be willing to consider has been conscious all the while?
Maybe. Who knows? Can I call an octopus conscious? Well, clearly it's conscious. It's over there eating something. Can I call it intelligence? Yeah, I can. It's a different type of intelligence, but we can, and there are many animals that we can do that with. So animal intelligence here is revealing in that not not everything is stupid, right? And what we consider as human beings as intelligence might be a bias, and that we're actually just one of a population of intelligent things living on this world. And I tend to prescribe to that. I don't really see an octopus ever building a Tesla, but at the same time, I'm not going to call it stupid. And, you know, by way of that, I don't eat octopus. They're too smart, you know. So I'm careful about that, because animal intelligence versus human intelligence, we're just different. We are different for this world. You know, we're weird, you know, other than our other, you know, even other homonyms, right? So you compare us to a Homo erectus, we're a lot smarter than that, apparently, you know. So we just have to remember that we occupy a very unique position on this world, and maybe in this universe, and that maybe our level of general intelligence is weird, you know, and doesn't happen very often. And that's the solution to the Fermi paradox, is that most of the universe thinks completely differently than we do. Or say for example, most inhabited exoplanets are entirely water worlds with no land. How do you harness fire? You know, how do you weld some? You know, so it may be that intelligence, more often than not, is simply locked in and has to exist in a natural environment by way of that environment, which would be water. And that our weird little planet with land that we can crawl out of the oceans and start walking around, maybe that's the weird thing. So there's just so many options as far as what could be happening in the universe that could shut things down, you know. And that's the simple solution to the Fermi paradox.
I think that's a perfect place to end, essentially where we started. But yeah, the amount of possibilities, the amount of potential. I mean, obviously, in a 1-hour conversation on every topic we covered, tip of the iceberg. Truly the tip of the iceberg.
Truly,
and
the
I
tip of the
appreciate you
iceberg.
taking the time to have the conversation with me.
Absolutely, anytime.